The next section in your textbook takes a look at reflexes. A reflex is a rapid, automatic, unlearned motor response to a stimulus. It helps preserve homeostasis by making rapid adjustments in the function of organs or organ systems. Reflexes show very little variability, meaning that when a particular reflex is activated, it produces the same motor response every time. Now, to define it, a reflex arc involves sensory fibers delivering information from periphery receptors to the central nervous system, and motor fibers carrying motor commands to peripheral effectors. The reflex arc is an example of negative feedback, as mentioned earlier in the semester. The response is usually to remove or oppose the original stimulus. In the simplest reflex arc, a sensory neuron synapses directly only on a motor neuron, and this is called a monosynaptic reflex. These control the most rapid, stereotyped motor responses of the nervous system. For example, I have a picture coming up of a stretch reflex, like the knee jerk reflex, which provides automatic regulation of skeletal muscle length. Now, this is not a picture of a monosynaptic reflex, but it is a nice figure of a reflex arc. So let me describe what we have going on here. In a reflex arc, you have a stimulus, and in this picture, it looks like the person is experiencing a stimulus of pain because they're touching a tack. And that stimulus is going to activate a sensory receptor. An action potential will travel down the afferent neuron, and information processing can occur if there's an interneuron present. An action potential then travels down the efferent neuron to the effector organ, which would be a motor, which would be a muscle group here as the effector, and that's going to respond. This is a nice picture of one of those knee jerk or patellar reflexes, which is a stretch reflex. That's controlled by the stretch receptors in the muscles that straighten the knee. So this is an example of a monosynaptic reflex. So typically what happens is the physician will use a hammer to strike the patellar tendon, and the muscle will stretch, which results in a sudden increase in the activity of a sensory neuron in that muscle, the rectus femoris, which synapses. So that sensory neuron, which has been stimulated, will synapse on the motor neurons in the spinal cord, and those are going to produce an immediate muscle contraction in the rectus femoris. And that leads to the foot kicking straight out. Now, many spinal reflexes have at least one interneuron, like the first picture, between the sensory and the motor neurons. And this is called a polysynaptic reflex. And these are going to include a longer delay between the stimulus and the response, because the more synapses you have, the more time it takes. However, this can typically elicit a more involved response. For example, withdrawal reflexes, like the flexor reflex, will move a body part away from the stimulation. And this is typically triggered by pain, but also by pressure and touch receptors, like touching a hot stove or touching a pin. When a specific muscle contracts, typically opposing muscles are going to be stretched at the same time. So when a flexor reflex is stimulated, the extensor muscles should be experiencing a stretch reflex. So that's where reciprocal inhibition comes into play. This is the flexor's antagonist being blocked. And this is going to ensure that flexation is no way interfered with by the stretch reflex of the extensor muscles, that antagonistic group. Now, like I said, reflexes are automatic, but higher brain centers can influence or modify them by stimulating or inhibiting the interneurons and motor neurons involved. One example besides reciprocal inhibition is Babinski's sign. This is triggered by stroking an infant's sole, and it results in fanning of the infant's toes. But as descending inhibitory synapses develop, an adult will respond by curling the toes instead, and this is then called a plantar reflex. So this picture demonstrates a flexor reflex, which is a type of withdrawal reflex. Notice that the biceps brachii is flexed here upon the painful stimulus, and the triceps brachii are going to be experiencing reciprocal inhibition. The information gathered by sensory receptors is called a sensation. Now, most processing of sensations occurs in centers along the sensory pathways in the spinal cord or the brainstem. The names of the major sensory and motor tracts of the spinal cord are based on the destinations of the axons, and this is noted in your textbook in Table 8-4. One example of an ascending sensory pathway is the posterior column pathway. It sends highly localized sensations to the cerebral cortex, and we'll look at this closely on the next slide. The sensations arrive organized such that sensory information from the toes reaches one of the end of the primary sensory cortex, and information from the head reaches the other. And as a result, the sensory cortex contains like a miniature map of the body surface, and this is called a sensory homunculus. And the map that I'm going to show you on the next slide is somewhat distorted because the area of sensory cortex that's devoted to a particular region is proportional to the number of sensory receptors it contains, not proportional to that region's size. So as you can see, the fingers and the lips have much larger areas as opposed to the back, which compared to size doesn't make sense, but it's not based on the size of that region, it's based on the number of sensory receptors that that region contains. So here's what happens. Sensations are going to travel along the axon of a sensory neuron to the central nervous system through the dorsal roots of the spinal cord. So you'll see that down at the bottom left, there's a red ribbon. That's where we're starting with this figure. So sensations are going to travel along that dorsal root of the spinal nerve. And then within the spinal cord, the axons ascend within the posterior column pathway to synapse in the sensory nucleus of the medulla oblongata. So that's that second section of this figure. The axons then cross to the opposite side of the brainstem before they continue on to the thalamus. Okay, so now we're up towards the top. The thalamic neurons then relay the information to the appropriate region of the primary sensory cortex. Now, in response to information provided by the sensory system, the central nervous system then issues motor commands. And these are distributed by the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system of the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system. The somatic nervous system is under voluntary control, and that's through the corticospinal pathway, which issues somatic motor commands that direct the contraction of skeletal muscles. The autonomic motor commands, the autonomic nervous system's motor commands are involuntary, so these are going to control the smooth and cardiac muscles, glands, fat cells via the medial and lateral pathways. And as is the case with the sensory homunculus, the proportions of the motor units present in a region of the body is not always proportional to that region's size. So you're going to get another picture here like the first one we saw, but this is an example of the corticospinal pathway. So these are motor. So instead of starting at the bottom of this figure, we're going to start up at the top with the primary motor cortex. So the corticospinal pathway begins at those triangular-shaped pyramidal cells of the cerebral cortex, and the axons of these upper motor neurons extend into the brainstem and the spinal cord. This is where they're going to synapse on lower motor neurons extending out of the ventral root of the spinal cord. Now, all axons of the corticospinal tract eventually cross over to reach motor neurons on the opposite side of the body somewhere. Now, the components of the medial and the lateral pathways aren't shown in this figure because they're spread out throughout the brain, like nuclei of the brainstem, thalamus, basal nuclei of the cerebrum, and cerebellum. So their output, not that's not important, because their output can stimulate or inhibit other nuclei or the activities of the pyramidal cells in the primary motor cortex. So we've reached a checkpoint, so pause the recording and answer these questions before you continue on. So your conscious thoughts, your plans, decisions, and your responses, these represent only a tiny fraction of the activities of your nervous system, and they actually have very little to do with immediate or long-term survival. In fact, adjustments made by the autonomic nervous system are much more important. Your book points out that without the autonomic nervous system, a simple night's sleep would be life-threatening as soon as you release control of your conscious thoughts. So the autonomic nervous system is responsible for those unconscious adjustments of homeostatically essential visceral responses. And we have two divisions of the autonomic nervous system: the somatic nervous system and the what I wanted to point out is that the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system are anatomically very different, because the somatic nervous system typically has one neuron that goes to just one skeletal muscle. However, in the autonomic nervous system, motor neurons in the central nervous system, which are called preganglionic neurons, are going to send axons, which are called preganglionic fibers, to autonomic ganglia in the peripheral nervous system. And these are called ganglionic neurons. So much more complex than the somatic nervous system. And these autonomic nervous system ganglionic neurons then are going to innervate cardiac and smooth muscles, glands, and fat cells. And as I wanted to talk about in the previous slide, there are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system: the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. So I got a little ahead of myself on the previous slide. Sorry about that. But in the sympathetic division, preganglionic fibers are short and postganglionic fibers are very long. The sympathetic division is often called the fight or flight division because it increases alertness, metabolic rate, sweating, heart rate, blood flow to skeletal muscles. It dilates respiratory bronchioles and the pupils. Blood flow to the digestive organs is decreased when the sympathetic division is activated. Epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla also support and prolong this effect of the sympathetic division. In the parasympathetic division, preganglionic fibers are long and postganglionic fibers are short. And that's what they're trying to depict here with this figure, which ones are long and which ones are short. The parasympathetic division is often regarded as the rest and digest system because it causes constriction of the pupils, it increases digestive secretions, it increases in digestive tract smooth muscle activity, it stimulates urination and defecation, it decreases heart rate. So that's why we like to call it the rest and digest division. Now, all preganglionic fibers are cholinergic, meaning that their neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, and they're all excitatory. Postganglionic parasympathetic synapses are cholinergic, and they can be excitatory or inhibitory depending on the receptor. Most postganglionic sympathetic synapses are adrenergic, meaning that they rely on norepinephrine as their neurotransmitter. And these are usually excitatory. So this is looking at the sympathetic division. And from spinal segments T1 to L2, sympathetic preganglionic fibers are going to join the ventral root of each spinal nerve. All of these fibers then exit the spinal nerve to enter the sympathetic chain ganglia. The collateral ganglia are unpaired ganglia that receive splenic nerves from the lower thoracic and the upper lumbar segments. Postganglionic neurons here innervate the abdominal pelvic cavity as pictured. Notice the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is actually modified neural tissue, and they secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine right into your blood capillaries, so they function like an endocrine gland. The effect is nearly identical to that of the sympathetic postganglionic stimulation of adrenergic synapses, and they're innervated by preganglionic fibers. In the parasympathetic division, preganglionic neurons arise from the brainstem and the sacral spinal cord, and these include cranial nerves 3, 4, 9, and 10. The cranial nerves are 3, 7, 9, and 10. And the vagus is a major parasympathetic nerve. These ganglia are very close to or within their target organ. The preganglionic fibers of the sacral iris form the pelvic nerves. There's less divergence than in the sympathetic division, so the effects are much more localized in this parasympathetic division. Now, if you flip back and forth between the two previous pictures, you'll notice that there's some organs that are innervated by both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. And this is a concept or an idea called dual innervation. So both of the divisions are going to be having an effect on the same organ, maybe not at the same time, but we need that antagonistic effect, because when I was listing the functions of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division, oftentimes I list effects on the same organ. So we have to innervate these organs from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. If you look very closely, you can find a couple that are only innervated by just one division. And that does bring us to the end of Chapter 8. I do have a couple of questions for you before you move on to Chapter 9.